All right, I'm going to get us started. We've got quite a bit to fit in this session. So welcome everybody. I'm Chris Reedy from the Institute for Sustainable Futures here at UTS, and welcome to this session on anticipatory planning for the energy transition. I want to set expectations. It says workshop, but there's not a lot of workshopping going on today. It is more of a panel session, but we are inviting you into what's going to be the development of some research projects that come out of a roadmap that we've done for the Race for 2030 CRC. So you can think of it as the start of a workshopping process, because these projects will be going into the call for proposals process from Race in the weeks and months ahead. So we've got a bit of a cast of speakers today. I'll be kicking us off with a bit of an intro about the project. We're going to have then some of my collaborators on we had a large team working on this project. So I've got Emmy Gui and Roger Dargaville, who will be speaking here live, and we're hoping we'll have Charlie Hargroves as well coming in via Zoom, and each talking about one of the different projects that have come out of this roadmap. So the roadmap, this is one of the many projects that the Race for 2030 CRC has been doing that you heard a little bit about this morning from John Jutson. And it's part of the theme called Race for Everyone, which is one of the 4 themes that Race has. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about Race. You've heard about them from John, and I'm sure most people here are pretty familiar with what they're doing. But we sit in the Race for Everyone theme, and what's been happening over the first 2.5 years of Race's existence is a whole series of opportunity assessments, as they're called. So looking at the current state of research in the many different research themes that Race has, looking for the gaps and the opportunities that Race can address over the 10 years of its existence, and then developing a research roadmap that the industry and research sector can follow over that time. So our particular project was in theme E2, which is called Innovative Foresighting and Planning. And the role of the opportunity assessment was really about assessing the way that the industry, the energy sector, is planning for the future and anticipating the future in this context of energy transition that we've heard so much about this morning. So we wanted to look at, is there potential for new kinds of foresighting approaches, new ways of thinking about the future that can help us to better navigate that energy transition, and try and develop a research roadmap for the activities that would happen in this theme over time. You can see the report there, which came out in December, the final report called Smarter Planning for the Energy Transition. And full credit to the many people listed in the citation there, and all of our partners in industry as well that have been part of the process over the last year or so. The way the project worked was it was essentially these opportunity assessments are partly literature review, looking at what's the current state of research, and partly stakeholder consultation. So a series of workshops involving industry participants as well as research participants, some interviews with key people in the industry, and 3 Horizons futures-oriented workshop to start to generate ideas about research that's needed in this theme. So 3 Horizons, for those who are not familiar with it, is a innovative way of thinking about the future. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but one of the things that we're really keen on in this theme is moving beyond sort of the traditional ways that we've grappled with the future to use some of the more innovative techniques that have been developed by futurists and strategic foresight thinkers over decades. So why do we need this kind of theme? Well, obviously there's energy transitions has a lot of uncertainty. Where are we going to go? So how fast are we going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? What sort of pathways? What sort of different fuel and technology mixes? What's the role of consumers, which we've heard a lot about already this morning? How is politics going to play into the transition? How's decentralisation going to shape the future of the energy system? How resilient is our infrastructure going to be? So lots of questions that we're still grappling with in this transition, and lots of different possible pathways that we can go down. So in that context, we've got to make decisions in this situation of uncertainty. And so that's what energy sector stakeholders are routinely doing. They're engaging in what's called anticipatory governance, governing in response to uncertainty. And to define a few terms that we're using, anticipation has grown out of work in futures studies and foresight as a terminology that futures thinkers are now using to try and establish a discipline of anticipation, of using and thinking about the future to guide present action. And you can think of it as all forward-looking attitudes and activities. And it's important thing about anticipation is it's not just thinking about the future because it's interesting or a fun thing to do, but actually using it to do something different in the present. And this term anticipatory governance has emerged fairly recently as well, as governing in the present to adapt or shape uncertain futures. So what we're about in this project was thinking about what sort of anticipatory governance does the energy sector need. There's different types of anticipation, different types of anticipatory governance. The three that we worked with mainly in this project were forecasting, which is when we're projecting the future, projecting from the present into the future, looking at the most likely or probable futures. It's often more quantitative and tries to be a little bit predictive, but it assumes that the system we're studying is going to continue to work more or less as it has been before. Can't cope with big discontinuities and a lot of those uncertainties that we were talking about, which is where other kinds of foresighting come in. So exploratory foresighting is trying to explore the full range of possible futures that might lie ahead. You can think of it as mapping out the future territory, the set of future possibilities. Can be quantitative, but often is also qualitative, so developing different scenarios for the future. And of course, AEMO in the Integrated System Plan has a series of scenarios that are talked about qualitatively and quantitatively. So that kind of work is already happening in the energy sector. But this kind of approach can deal quite well with discontinuities and uncertainties about the future. Uses things like scenarios, the three horizons method that I've talked about, and so on. And then there's what's called normative foresighting, which is saying, okay, there's this range of possible futures out there. What's the one that we're aiming for? What's the one that we want to bring into reality? If the exploratory is about mapping, this is about navigating. So that's visioning techniques, identifying or imagining desirable futures, road mapping to try and find our way towards those kind of futures. And they've each got their strengths and weaknesses, and bringing those kind of three different kinds of anticipation together can be a really beneficial thing for anticipatory governance. So we looked at, one of the things we did in the opportunity assessment was look at how much of each of those types of anticipation is happening in the sector. Another we did was look at how well does the sector consider different driving forces for the future. And we used a fairly typical technique here called STEEP V, which is thinking about the social, technological, economic, environmental, political and values-based drivers for the future. And again, we looked at in the sort of key anticipatory publications for the energy sector, how much are they considering drivers from those different categories. So we gathered a lot of different publications that are grappling with the future and planning for the future. This is just a sampling of them. There's about 24 that we looked at in detail. You can see just a few of the kind of things that we looked at there. Australian government and state government documents, but also market bodies and industry publications as well. And we assessed all of those for the extent to which they were doing different kinds of anticipation and dealing with different kinds of drivers. And where we got to is that there's a lot more normative foresighting going on in the sector than exploratory foresighting. So not a lot of work that's doing that kind of mapping out of the full range of possibilities. The AEMO's ISP is perhaps an exception there, but even that process tends to lock in around a particular scenario as being the one that's used in the optimal development path, rather than saying how can we be flexible across this full range of possibilities. So a bit of a gap there around exploratory foresighting in the sector. And then we found that certain categories of drivers are not considered as much as others. So values-based drivers, what are the values of consumers, how might they shift in the future? Political drivers, a lot of these processes try and step back from the politics and say that's too uncertain to deal with, so we're just going to work with current policy settings. Whereas futures thinking can think about, well, what might be different possible political futures as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to move on that quick. So what we were seeing was that key actors in the system are tending to pick winners and pursue those pretty vigorously, rather than exploring the full range of possible futures, and then favouring and trying to favour actions that can keep options open, which is something we're suggesting should be done more of. And a few examples there: carbon capture and storage more in the past, but more recently SNOE 2.0 and pumped hydro, and now hydrogen, of course, is the big focus. So are we putting out all of our eggs in one basket with some of these approaches? And we felt that anticipation in the energy sector still owes a lot to an outdated tradition of building to meet predicted growing demand. So we've developed these forecasting capacities that were really good in that kind of situation, but are not working so well in this new context that we find ourselves in. And that means that these disruptive processes, you can think of the rise of peak demand from air conditioners in the past, what's going on now with rooftop solar, and perhaps on the horizon with electric vehicles, has been catching the industry by surprise. And our anticipatory methods are not up to scratch with keeping up with these developments. So we summed up with these 8 gaps in anticipatory governance for energy transitions. And the first is that there hasn't been a real tradition at the higher levels in government, in institutions, of supporting futures thinking and anticipatory work. In some other countries, there's units of foresight that are very central to government, are very well resourced, and we haven't had that sort of support in Australia over the years. We're still not having least cost whole of system planning practices. AEMO has been moving in the right direction, but their remit does not really cover the whole of the energy system. So there's still work to do in moving towards that. We heard a lot from stakeholders that the data needed to support anticipation is either not available, or it's often commercially in confidence, so it's not accessible. So there's no sort of one-stop shop where you can go to find the kind of data you need to think about the future. We heard a lot this morning, there's not a great understanding of current and future customer needs, aspirations and values, so that's a really key uncertainty that has been making it difficult to understand what possible futures might be out there. There hasn't been a lot of use of exploratory and imaginative methods for thinking about the future. We've tended to rely on much more traditional kind of forecasting approaches. Lack of exposure to different kinds of plausible futures to build adaptive capacity and reflexivity. So that's that lack of exploratory foresighting that I was talking about. We don't yet, although we're inching closer, have a system-wide approach for mobilising towards co-creating zero carbon futures. And although I think there's a lot of great stakeholder consultation that happens in the sector, there's not a lot of spaces where there's a space for genuine, diverse stakeholder dialogue that's both influential and encourages perspectives from all across the system. So given those gaps, the research roadmap that we've come up with has a series of 4 core projects and some supporting projects alongside that. And we're going to hear more about each of those from our speakers shortly. So I'm not going to go into the details of those. We'll leave that for the speakers to come. But as we go through that, I want you to keep in mind the 2 questions I've got down the bottom of the slide there. And this is, I guess, a little bit of a nod towards the workshop styling of this session, and we'll hopefully have some room for some discussion about these towards the end. But what's happening now with this process is that RACE is going to put out calls for proposals for the top 4 projects on that list there in the month or so ahead. And we're really looking for collaborators, partners, people that want to work on these projects, that think about ways that you could make them more useful for your work as well, and ways that we can make them more useful for the energy system as a whole. So think about how these projects might help with your work, and how they could be modified to better help with your work, and what more is needed to anticipate and plan for energy futures in Australia. Are there really important things that are missing from this list of projects? We consulted a lot with stakeholders in industry, but there's probably more that could be done. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to our next speaker, who I will first introduce. So Emmy Gui is Energy Systems Lead at ClimateWorks Centre, come up from Melbourne. Emmy's energy transition and decentralised energy system expert at ClimateWorks within the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, focusing on system-level transformative solutions and knowledge collaboration to strengthen the links between energy and climate. I'll only do a short bio to give her more time to speak, but Emmy was part of the great team that worked together on the opportunity assessment. So she's going to talk to us about the first project on the list, the Decentralised Energy Data Inventory. Over to you, Emmy.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for this opportunity, and great to see some old and new faces. So in the next 10 minutes, I'll start talking about decentralized energy data inventory, which I identified as a key project for RACE 2030 E2 theme going forward. How do I believe? Yeah. So as many keynote speakers mentioned earlier on today, so there are many uncertainties around decentralized energy space. At the moment in the Australian energy market, of course, I hear characterized into 4 different categories: energy technology adoption, customer energy management, decentralized energy integration, and of course, invisible behind the meter data. So these areas certainly are least understood at the moment in the research community, in the industry. And of course, they are hugely important to medium to long-term energy planning, and hugely important to all levels of the decision makers in governments, in industry, investment community, and also customers. So as mentioned by Chris earlier on, RACE 2030 E2 projects are to look into these critical challenges in energy transition, and particularly provide evidence on how the trend in decentralized energy is likely to evolve, and their impacts on longer-term energy planning. Decentralized energy data inventory projects will help to collect and curate data and information, more importantly to provide insights into technology trends, market trends, consumer trends, and innovation trends to support Australia's least cost energy strategy and a net zero energy future. These are some of the objectives set out by the RACE E2 opportunity assessment. So the key aim for the projects is to bridge the decentralized energy data gaps to support the whole of a system anticipatory planning, particularly addressing data gaps and needs for the development of DESU, least cost energy strategy, and future reports, provide insights into decentralized energy technology adoption, utilization, trends, customer expectations, motivations, drivers for their behaviors and actions, of course, to establish the data collection process and repository for ongoing data update, operation, maintenance, and also governance. So earlier, understanding mega trends, change drivers are essential and critically important as foundation for to understand and plan for the future. So earlier on, Treasury also made reference to mega trends in terms of how mega trends in climate change impacts the decision making in investment communities, about how they think about economic and investment risks. Generally, the weight for the historical knowledge is very useful to form the basis to looking at identify trends and assessing their impacts. But given many technologies are quite new and have limited historical reference, with limited years of development, it's important to develop forecasting or foresighting techniques that could better incorporate future intelligence and future knowledge. So decentralized energy data inventory project can potentially help to understand the large pictures and path dependencies and form the basis for the development of a least cost energy strategy and other decentralized energy projects and initiatives. There are three critical elements driving all trends. So basic needs, drivers of change, and innovation. So in energy, basic needs of consumers from supply and demand side, home, buildings, transport, and industry. Of course, increasingly, in a broader sense, it also includes the needs of whole of economy, which is more evident in developing country contexts. So many of the developing economies really consider energy planning as an opportunity for economic growth and new industry development. In Australia, energy planning certainly could play a bigger role in supporting national and regional economic agenda. For example, green hydrogen strategies, manufacturing clean energy supply chains, and innovation. I also want to highlight three aspects related to level of automation, level of decentralization, and level of self-sufficiency, which is critical for longer-term planning to understand the trends in this. So in the middle, you can see the red part is the intersection of the three elements, which is really the sweet spot to help to understand the energy futures and how it might evolve and support the longer-term energy planning. So we also identified a number of key existing literatures from various organizations in, for example, ECA, ESB, from SoERC, and RACE 2030 have a number of projects and themes addressed on the demand side, and also Monash digital energy futures also look to understand the emerging technology consumer nexus to answer some of these challenges. While these initiatives provide very useful information and some of them address certain challenges provide certain insights in particular areas, but overall, the reference to the energy future at the system level can be still limited. So this is where the decentralized energy data inventory projects is looking to address, to really provide the useful insight from data and information more holistically to enable the decision making. Again, this is very much the proposed decentralized energy data inventory structure, and in 3 different categories. So the first category related to the key technology-enabled product services, and the second category includes customer energy management aspects and how a consumer reacts to, for example, time of use tariffs, dynamic pricing, and different energy management programs, and also how they think, how they make connection between energy management and energy productivity. The third category, of course, is to understand consumer interests and behavior. This is very critical in looking forward in terms of what decentralized energy assets and investment is going to develop, and also the consumer behaviors. The goal is very much to establish an open data sharing arrangement, really to support effective planning, consistent policy decision making, and the tracking of pathways and goal alignments. Here are some of the things that we could do to achieve that. I won't go into details. Of course, this is without challenges, I mentioned there are multi-level uncertainties in terms of technology trends, market and business trends, consumer trends, behaviors, policy trends, and of course, economic futures. And how to best utilize and integrate the existing data collection process and data portals by various organizations are very critical as well. Overall, there is a need for a better coordination among the actions taken by various organizations. Of course, dealing with the big data and develop better data analytics to provide insight into the future, and issues related to data governance and ongoing updates and maintenance, potentially have resolved the privacy issues and many other challenges. So I will stop here. Hand over to you.
So that first project is really critical for addressing the data gaps that I talked about at the start. If we're going to better plan for the future, we need to make sure there's access to the data to do that. The next one is about how you bring that together into a least cost energy strategy, starting to think about whole of system planning. So to talk about that, we have Roger Dargaville, who is the Deputy Director of the Monash Energy Institute, Senior Lecturer and Researcher in Renewable Energy in Monash University Civil Engineering Department. And I'll hand over to Roger.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. Okay, this has been a really interesting project to work on with Chris, and I can't thank him enough for the huge amount of work he did pulling together a diverse group of researchers during essentially lockdown, when we had to do everything remotely, and it's extremely difficult to manage this. So a real achievement to do that. I'll start off with what we sort of traditionally look at when we do a strategic energy strategy. We look at a broad range of generation technologies we've got available, so our coal, oil, gas being our conventional generators, hydropower as well, and then our new generation, well, new, they're not so new anymore really, but your wind, your solar, and then some emerging technologies, battery technology, pumped hydro, for example. We use a reasonably straightforward optimization framework to say what's the least cost combination of all these technologies so that we can meet a demand profile. Traditionally, we assume that demand profile is somewhat fixed, that people will keep on doing whatever they've been doing, and we know what that demand will look like in the future, or we assume we know it will look like, and it's deterministic in that we assume we know what the future will look like, and so we can work out what the least cost combination of those technologies will be. We've got lots of examples of this approach being used, and Chris has already mentioned AEMO's ISP. It's actually evolved quite a lot over the last few years and is becoming much more sophisticated than the base case that we would typically talk about. But we have our technologies, we have our scenarios, and we run our optimization model, and we get an answer as to what the energy system of the future might look like. And we've got this nice pretty picture here that shows you, lots of yellow at the top there, and then which is our utility and rooftop PV, lots of wind energy, and then our dispatchable technologies, which is a combination of batteries, hydro, and a little bit of peaking gas and liquids there in this particular scenario from AEMO. I mentioned it's becoming more sophisticated in that it's not purely deterministic anymore. We actually run a number of scenarios, and AEMO is using this approach called least regrets, where we don't just find the least cost, we find the least risk scenario. One of the challenges with Australia's energy system is that it's not centrally run. We don't have a government-led plan that says we're going to build these technologies. It's a largely privatised system, and we're relying on investors to put money into new projects that may or may not get built. And we hear all the time about projects that have been proposed, blueprints drawn up, and then they fall over at the last hurdle to get investment to move forward. So things like Snowy 2.0, it's under construction. Let's assume that it's going to get built, but it might not. They might work out, decide actually these tunnels are just way too expensive, and let's pull out of it because we're wasting billions of dollars. We've got the Marinus link, enhancing connection between Tasmania and Victoria. Might get built, might not. That's even higher risk. Lots of other projects may or may not happen. And so when you're trying to forecast the future and you don't know whether these major infrastructure projects are going to go ahead or not, you want to build a strategy where you say, well, if this element doesn't get built, would we have wasted a lot of investment on a particular strategy which would then become a stranded resource, stranded asset? So the least regret is a more sophisticated version. But it's still assuming that we know a lot of what's happening on the demand side, which for the race CRC, the focus is we actually know relatively little about what's happening on demand side and what the demand side response is going to be. In terms of forecasting for the future, and again, Chris touched on a few of these things, when systems transition, they often transition rapidly, much more rapidly than we expect, and it's very stochastic or random. And we can look at examples such as when we moved from horse-drawn carts to cars, when the internet became available, mobile phone technology. These transitions happened remarkably quickly, and once it was established, we look backwards and go, well, you can barely imagine the world before that happened. So imagining the world of the future, when we get there, we'll look back and go, well, obviously, we know how we got here and it all makes sense. But from this position looking forward, it's extremely difficult to imagine what the world will look like. And we've got a system moving forward where energy consumers are much more engaged. And the question is how much more engaged they will be is we don't know. And Lynn Gallagher in her presentation, I think she's quite optimistic about the level of engagement that energy consumers will have, whether it's residential, small business or large scale. But she does acknowledge that it's extremely difficult. And that level of understanding of the network, of the energy system for most consumers is very low, and so their ability to interact is difficult. But if we manage it well with regulatory systems, which mean that a lot of those decisions are out of the hands of the end users, they only get the benefits and not have to deal with all the challenges, then a huge amount of DSM could be put into the system. We've got our rooftop PV, behind the meter batteries, our electric vehicles, and then all this demand response and energy efficiency that are going to play really important roles in the future, not just how much wind, solar and hydro that we build. I was a bit disappointed in Lynn's talk that she didn't talk about hot water more. And she said, I'm not going to talk about hot water. It's one of the simplest demand responses that we have available, and yet we still don't seem to be able to harness that. You could put a really simple widget on every domestic hot water system that would respond to availability of wind and solar in the grid and turn on or off that hot water system. And we can't seem to do that. So is that insurmountable? The day it happened, or the year or two when that happens and they get installed, it'll be a really rapid transition, and hopefully that'll happen, but who knows. Energy policy also can shift very quickly, and we're seeing that. For example, Victorian Government recently announced that they're going to recreate the SCCV. That puts a lot more control back in government hands and therefore changes the paradigm dramatically. We're seeing global shifts in policy such as the EU border tariffs, which will more or less force Australia's hand in terms of having a carbon price. And so you may have thought for the longest time Australia will never have a carbon price. That's been more or less a poison chalice politically. We actually may not have a choice and to be having that put in place very quickly. So all this leads us to the point that when we're doing projections, we can make a forecast into the future, and it really isn't a forecast, it's just a projection for a set of assumptions. It's a straw person, it probably won't happen. Turning that into a plan is actually really, really challenging. And we've got the challenge that it's a privatised market in that the government has relatively small control over what actually gets invested in. They can set up policies and targets, but the investment decisions are absolutely critical. And understanding those decisions from the investor's point of view is really critical. A lot of the least cost investment decisions are relatively low return on investment, long-term strategies that might have 10 or 20-year payback. And if you look at that from an investor point of view, you're not going to invest in them. So you need some kind of government intervention to make them happen, and government intervention seems to be quite difficult to manage. It was mentioned earlier this morning about the market design. Is the market fit for purpose? Is it going to provide the appropriate investment decisions, investment signals to get the right investments to actually achieve the least cost system? And then perhaps what I think is the most optimal outcome of some of these least cost studies is actually informing government policy so that we have half a chance of reaching a low cost. We'll never get the least cost. That's impossible because it's a pie in the sky and there's too many variables. But at least we can get to a low cost, low carbon energy system of the future. That would be a really good outcome. I'm going to finish there to allow as much time for discussion as we move on. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Roger. So, next one is mine. This is the third project in the roadmap, is an Australian Energy Futures report. So we've heard about filling the data gaps, we've heard about bringing those together into better planning for, if not least cost, at least a low cost outcome that considers many of the different possibilities, the different kinds of technologies, the decentralised as well as centralised. This third project is about trying to expose more people in the energy system to a broader range of possible futures that might lie ahead. That takes in the different kinds of foresighting that we see as a bit neglected at the moment, so exploratory foresighting particularly, so looking at different ranges of futures beyond perhaps what AEMO considers in its ISP, looking at different ways of structuring scenarios, scenarios that might bring in wildcard situations, but also better consideration of some of the categories of drivers that were a bit neglected. So what's going to happen with customer values in the future? What's going to happen with politics and cross-border politics, like the EU tariffs example that Roger just put up? And right now, our market bodies understandably steer away from those different kinds of political futures, whereas in this kind of report, it's something that we can look at much more explicitly. So the idea is to support more robust and informed decision-making by reviewing and publicising a broader range of possible futures for the energy system. The intention is this would be a biennial report series. And the first report tentatively is going to focus around the future of Australian energy system planning. So What are different scenarios for us to move towards a better outcome for whole of system and zero carbon planning? And that could really open up a lot of possibilities. It could open up, we've got a lot of different regulatory and market bodies at the moment. Could we look at a different structure for how we regulate the energy system that's a bit more streamlined? It could throw out, how can we better involve people from across the whole sector, stakeholders that might have different views about where the future could be going in shaping that future. So the intention is it'll be a qualitative review of possible futures for the energy system. It's going to summarise energy megatrends to set the context for energy planning. There'll be some evaluation of current energy system planning in there. We've done a little bit of that in our opportunity assessment, but this is a chance to go a bit deeper. It'll be a participatory process, so we'll aim to involve stakeholders from across the system in developing this view of the future. And then it's going to explore alternative pathways for achieving the vision that emerges from that consultation. We often get asked, how does this sit with processes like the integrated system plan? And it's not intended to, certainly not intended to replace that. I don't know why that keeps moving on. But to complement it, and perhaps also to challenge it, to say, there are futures here that aren't being considered that may be very important. And so this is a chance to look at what's in the future sector called weak signals, things that are on the horizon but a lot of people haven't noticed yet, wildcards that could have a big impact but might be low probability. And a lot of that can come by engaging different sets of stakeholders to those who feel empowered to engage in something like the integrated system plan. I'm not going to go too much into those objectives. I think I've spoken to most of those. One of the things that we'll do, though, is there's a lot of research themes happening in the RACE CRC, and this is a chance to bring the thinking about where the future is headed from those many different themes together into a really accessible publication that we hope will be something that people across the sector could read and engage with. Some examples of the kind of thing we're talking about. Many of you would have seen Cyro's work last year and previously on global megatrends. So this is a really accessible way of breaking down what are the big things that are happening in the world that have got a lot of momentum that we need to be thinking about and planning for in our organisations. So these are global megatrends. We'd be looking to do a set of energy megatrends that are much more specific to the energy system. And some of them will be similar to the kind of things you see here, but obviously there's a chance when you focus in on energy to dive down into a next level of detail. I've talked about the AEMO's scenarios, and you can see that there's a set of axes they've used here with that they differ around the degree of decentralisation in the scenario and the underlying demand, and that gives a sort of one way of thinking about the range of possible futures. But there's others, of course. The World Energy Council scenarios have a more qualitative approach and have used these metaphors of modern jazz, unfinished symphony and hard rock for their different futures. And I won't dig into those, but they've thought about what are the things that they see as givens, as the sort of foundational assumptions, things like a slow growth rate of the global population, rise of new technologies, and what are critical uncertainties that drive these different scenarios. So what's the pace of innovation and productivity? What priority is given to climate change and connected issues? So with a different kind of scenario approach, you can start to bring out different thinking that might be useful for the energy sector in Australia. The UK's equivalent to AEMO, the National Grid ESO scenarios, have a different set of axes that are based around the speed of decarbonisation and the level of societal change. So this is a way of bringing in a bit more explicitly a consumer future, the changes in values that we might see in the future. So when Lynn was talking this morning, to what extent are consumers going to embrace this transition and be part of it? To what extent are they going to just want it done for them and to be able to step back from that? Not a lot of people actually get really excited about energy like those in this room probably do. So for a lot of people, they'll be not wanting to be that engaged in the energy transition. But this is a way to think about those different kinds of futures. So we'll be exploring some of those different ways of setting up scenarios and perhaps using some innovative methods like 3 horizons to help stakeholders think through the future possibilities and map those out in the report. A lot of consultation still to do as we move into developing this as a project, but this is a bit of a sense of what the structure of the report could look like. Again, I'm not going to go into the details here, but happy to talk more about that. So that's the third project. Do we have Charlie online? Yes. All right. So Charlie Hargroves is joining us via Zoom, and Charlie is, oops, I've just lost his bio. So Charlie is an internationally renowned expert in sustainable economic development, working with the business, university, government and civil society sectors. He's at Curtin University and based in Adelaide, and I'm delighted that he's able to join us via Zoom. So over to you, Charlie, to talk about the DSU.
Thank you so much, Chris. Can I just check that I'm coming through okay?
You are indeed. Go for it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much again to the organisers for allowing me to Zoom in. My daughter had her first day of high school today, and it was pretty special to be there for that. So I do really appreciate that. Thank you firstly also to Chris and the team that have put the opportunity assessment together. It was a very detailed and quite a long process with quite a lot of engagement, not your usual sort of project. So it needed a lot of rigour behind it. And Chris has done a lot of late hours and a lot of the extra work to make that happen. So thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate that. I'd also like to acknowledge Chris Dunstan, one of the founders of the CRC and one of the key players who was the advocate for the DSU project, which I'm going to mention briefly. And it's part of his leadership that's led to this project stream. So I'm just going to quickly cover the why, what, the when and the how. Not to bog things down too much, but sort of why we're doing it is really just to complement the ESU. We think that the CRC thinks there's a role for having its researchers staying right on the cutting edge of what's happening in the DER or the DE space, particularly looking at technologies and business models and governance models as the evidence is kind of happening in real time. We really want evidence-based. There's a lot of theories, a lot of models and different things, but now we're actually getting to the point where projects are up and running that we can take evidence from, and we can start to put that together in a structured way that for the first couple of years can complement the ESU, and then ideally provide a structure and some momentum to incorporate that type of content into the ESU going forward. So at this point, the strategy for the project is to release 2 DSUs, which complement very closely and are written intentionally to complement the ESU. The first one will be released in April 2024, and then the second in June 2026. And after that would focus on integration with ESU and other types of structures in the same space. The process is pretty straightforward, a lot of research, some internal review, public comment, and then release of these documents, looking for opportunities and sort of best practices that are proving themselves, particularly in Australia. We'll obviously bring in best practices from around the world that may be leading, but our focus will really be to make sure that as great things are happening in this space in Australia, they're quickly documented, thoroughly and rigorously documented, and able to be incorporated into a range of different things. So the other 3 projects that we mentioned today will obviously be keeping very close with them, so we can help them to stay right up to date with what the sort of latest things are, but also learn from the research that's being done there. There's 2 other big projects that are happening across the CRC. The first one is the strategic EV integration project that I'm involved in, so it'll definitely complement that, and also the Net Zero Precincts project, which is going to proposals being developed right now. So the idea is obviously to parallel the ESU and provide the distributed energy resource kind of element, but also to provide this update to the CRC and its partners and partner organisations and researchers. The scope of it is really to look at, I'm just reading straight from the scope here, so updating the progress on different options and thinking about applications like being able to counteract reducing levels of thermal generation reliability, enhancing the reliability of supply to assist in meeting interim reliability measure. What implications are there for reliability forecasting? We want to work very closely with the teams, with Chris and the teams that are in the forecasting space to inform that process. Also managing minimum demand thresholds and really just looking at how the DER space is opening up, what opportunities that's creating for different types of actors. We'll also be very interested in looking at the energy sector and its integration and interaction with other sectors. Now that the transport sector is electrifying and homes are becoming more and more electrified, there will be opportunities to integrate those. So there's quite a lot. Obviously, everyone in the room understands there's quite a lot happening. I want to go too much further into it, but how to get involved. As we discussed, the CRC has a very active partner model. This project will focus initially on the existing partners of the CRC and ensuring their involvement, both by financial support and active engagement in the project. But we are also encouraged to engage with new partners that may be involved in particular projects. There's a structure that allows project partners to join for a certain period under certain financial contribution requirements, things like that Mark Squires can run. Any of you in the audience, if I can't see anybody apart from my screen, but I'm assuming there's some people there. Mark Squires is the man to talk to about partnerships there, and I'm sure he is in the room or someone from his team is there. This particular project we're hoping to be led by Curtin and UTS, so it's Scott Dwyer and the team from UTS who may also be there, some of the guys there, and my team from Curtin, so Peter Newman and Dean Economou and Ben and a few others that are from Western Australia. So we can learn from both the Western grid and the Eastern Central grid on what the opportunities are. We're also likely to be working again with our long-term colleagues and partners at Monash and Griffith and UniSA and other things. So right now we really just want to make sure that it's a very targeted project and has a very specific outcome to support the ESU, but also to make sure that the CRC and the researchers involved, particularly in the Race for Anything and the Race for Network Streams, are very much kept up to date with evidence-based advances in this field, because we have a lot of theory-based advances and we have a lot of academic-based advances, which is really great. We really want to make sure this project differentiates itself by making sure as soon as something is proven, even if it's just to a little degree, we start to make sure that gets incorporated into what's happening. And we would love to have everyone's involvement in it, of course. Chris, if there's any other, maybe if there's anyone else who want to comment about it, anyone from UTS who's there, and Scott, if you want to jump up and say anything, but I think that pretty much covers it. How does that sound, Chris?
That's great, Charlie. Thank you. And thanks so much for zooming in. So we'll move to questions now. My own foresighting, ironically, has not been so great in this session, so we've only got 7 minutes left. But over to you for any questions or discussion. And do think about those questions I posed earlier, which really was asking how could these projects, which are going out for call for proposals soon, how could they help your own work? Is there ways we could make them work better for you? And is there anything that's missing? Are there other things we need to be doing to deal with the challenges of planning for the energy transition? So over to you for questions, and if you could please come to the microphone with any questions or comments so that people online can hear, that would be great. Owen.
Following up on the conversation Charlie was kicking off on around the ESU, and sort of hesitate to ask with AMO colleagues in the room, so apologies if I don't get this correct, but my understanding of the ESU is it's very much like a Monte Carlo model, probabilistic, looks at all sorts of different scenarios about to determine what might happen and consider what might need to be done to respond to that. So just interested in your thoughts, Chris, of the panels around the role for that sort of technical assessment, looking at things probabilistic versus the story you might hear more in the newspapers and others about, oh, here's one particular scenario that I'm particularly worried about and needing to avoid that. Yeah.
Thanks, Owen. Charlie, do you want to perhaps take that one?
My apologies, I'm muted. I think from my point of view, my focus is really to focus on bringing together the evidence base on what's happening in the sector to inform however people want to chop up scenarios. My focus is more on the sort of practical, technical application sort of space. So I'm sure there's some people in the room there that would be able to answer that question a lot better. If there's someone from AMO, maybe, I don't know if Matthew was able to make it there.
Roger's going to the mic.
Respond a little bit as well. I think there's what we need is a strategic planning framework where we can respond to changes in the system. So it's a dynamic forecasting system. So we don't just say, here's a trajectory out to 2050, we might do this one, here's another trajectory out to 2050, where we have, as I said, a dynamic response where we say, we start off with an initial signal, and it might be a pricing signal that consumers see. And then based on how consumers respond, whether it's at the residential or business sector level, that results in a different trajectory. And by looking at a probabilistic range of different responses, we can say, here's the range of different outcomes that we could be looking at. And then you end up with a more realistic approach, because if we assume that the system is static and that consumers don't respond to different scenarios, then you get the wrong answer. So a more dynamic, responsive feedback loop forecasting system will be really, really important in response to the questions before.
Thanks, Roger. Yep.
Drew Clark, Chair of AEMO. I'm really delighted with some of the things that I've heard around research projects that can inform AEMO's work, so it's been a really interesting session. Just remark on the ISP and the ESUs and GSUs. They're widely misunderstood documents, not helped by their obscure titles, which are quite misleading. And of course, they're dynamic documents, they're continuously updated and all the rest of it. And at least the last O in the SU outlook gives some sense of it, but the ISP is not a plan in the literal sense. The only thing in which it's deterministic is some interconnection and transmission projects that get a kickstart into a regulatory process. That's it. That's the only thing that it actually determines. That could change, of course, and many would argue, myself included, that it should change, but right now it's a misleading title. I think on the ESU problem, the way the media interprets the ESUs particularly unhelpful. The purpose of the SUs are to send an investment signal to draw a response from the private sector or policymakers in order to avoid an outlook that says there's a shortcome. They're not actually a forecast. There will be a shortcome. There will be blackouts. We will run out of gas. It's no, we need this, this and this in order to avoid that. And the way in which the SUs are presented to try and change that perception that it's actually a signal to the market and to policy rather than a forecast of an expected outcome. In fact, the outcome is not expected because we expect the market and policy to respond to the signals. So, they're observations, not questions, but I certainly welcome the input from the research community into the evolution of those documents.
Yeah, and I think particularly with the DSU project, which was, it's a commitment in RACE's contract with the Commonwealth Government. We really want to explore what makes that useful, and I think it needs to be a close engagement as it develops with AEMO, and RACE has already thought about eventually these should be integrated, but I wonder if we could perhaps move towards that sooner than what's in the current RACE plan. So that's perhaps something that Charlie and the team can consider with AEMO over the months ahead. Thank you. We are at time. So I want everyone to get to lunch on time, of course. So big thanks to everyone for coming along, and particular thanks to our speakers, to Roger, to Emmy and Charlie for joining us and sharing thoughts about the research projects. And of course to all of the team that's been involved with this roadmap. It's funny, I've only met Emmy and Roger in person for the first time today, so we've done this whole project together in the era of COVID, and it's great to be in the same room together finally. Sorry you can't be here as well, Charlie. But, so thank you all, and if you do have any further questions for us, or you're interested in any of the projects, very happy to chat more over lunch or any time in the future. But we'll close it there. Thank you very much.